Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. In addition to our special guests, we have a broad and diverse coalition of business leaders, particularly but not exclusively small business leaders from across our region. I'm going to give a brief introduction, then we're going to dive in. You know, the last 100 days have been especially challenging for all of us, right? I mean, first we had the public health emergency caused by the pandemic. Then we had the economic meltdown precipitated by COVID. Then we had urgent calls for racial justice, for police reform, and for rooting out bias in all our institutions. All this in Los Angeles on top of homelessness, our affordable housing crisis, and so much more. It's been a hectic, challenging period for all of us. And that's been particularly true for our business community and our small businesses especially. I mean, let's look at all the challenges you've had to confront. You've had to close your doors, but you still have to pay the bills. You've had to take pay cuts if you get paid at all, and your employees the same. Reopening has been very bumpy and up and down. Again, today, news about the spread of the pandemic makes the reopening even more complex. You need access to capital just to keep your doors open. You might be fashioning a robust online presence for the first time ever. Your employees, as I mentioned, are struggling. Your families are struggling. You need to pay attention to your families, and you have to protect your health. All this while trying to remain hopeful and resilient. And we know that certain sectors of the small business community have been particularly hard hit. That's especially true for minority-owned businesses here. It's very tough, I get it. But there are signs of hope. I want to tell one brief story. You know, I live in the Fairfax area of Los Angeles. And while almost all the protests have been peaceful, in my neighborhood over one weekend, there was looting and vandalism. I awakened very early on Sunday morning after that happened. I was intent on organizing an effort in my neighborhood to help small business pick up the pieces. But I soon realized that wasn't going to be necessary. As I went out onto the streets you know, Fairfax, 3rd Street, Beverly, here's what I saw. I saw my neighbors with dustpans and brooms, helping business owners clean up the glass and the debris. I saw other neighbors erasing graffiti that had been scrawled on public places, on doorposts, and on windows. I saw my neighbors reaching out to support small businesses. I saw a group of neighbors, for example, just trying to console a business owner whose front window had been shattered, all her merchandise had been taken. She had lost everything, but my neighbors were there for her. In other words, what I saw that morning was, in many ways, the best of who we can be in Los Angeles. Neighbors standing up for each other. It was a resilient, hopeful moment in Los Angeles. And I want to pick up on that theme because today we're going to be asking some tough questions and getting some concrete answers. We're going to be marshaling the very best of Los Angeles. We're going to dive into what we're going to call R3, rebuild, recover, and reimagine Los Angeles. So here's our format. We're going to hear from two special guests in just a moment. Then I'm going to moderate a discussion with them, asking them questions and spurring conversation between them. And then we're going to segue into a question and answer session where all the participants on this Zoom meeting are able to ask their questions. And the way to do that is to send an email to rob.wilcox@lacity.org, rob.wilcox@lacity.org. When you send Rob an email, he's going to let us know who's asking a question, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask your question live. Let me proceed now to our introductions. We're just thrilled to have with us the Secretary of California's Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency, Secretary Lourdes Castro Ramirez. She was appointed by Governor Newsom and sworn in on March 2nd. Little did she know what she was in for when she was sworn in on March 2nd. She leads key initiatives to create inclusive economic opportunities here in California and expand affordable housing. She also oversees departments that license more than 3 million professionals, that monitor banking and financial services, that enforce civil rights, and fund affordable housing. She worked previously under the Obama administration. The president had appointed her to lead the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Public and Indian Housing Division. She also most recently served as the president and CEO of San Antonio's Housing Authority. And in that role, she secured a federal Choice Neighborhood Grant to create community-centered revitalization in San Antonio. We need that revitalization here throughout the state of California. I'd like to invite Secretary Castro Ramirez to make a few remarks. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for organizing this event and also including me in this conversation. And you're right, I started on March the 2nd, and on March the 4th, the governor declared a state of emergency due to the information that we had with regard to this COVID pandemic. As you mentioned, our agency oversees 12 entities with over 6,500 public service employees who are working every single day to preserve and expand affordable housing. Also focused on finding comprehensive solutions to end homelessness, protecting consumers while also ensuring a fair marketplace, and guarding the civil rights of all Californians. Housing production, access, and affordability are key priorities of this administration, and I'm very honored to be joining Governor Gavin Newsom and the administration in leading this work and working in partnership with local leaders, with Los Angeles, with cities all across the state, to close the affordability gap and to produce more housing that's accessible to working families. To advance these priorities, we, on an annual basis, issue about $3.5 billion in loans that every year help families become first-time home buyers. And we're also providing about $2 billion in funding to preserve and expand affordable housing opportunities. Also with responsibility for licensing over 4 million professionals and businesses, we recognize the importance of maintaining a strong workforce as we rebuild, recover, and reimagine. I'd like to just take a moment to share with you all some of the efforts that have been ongoing in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that this is a global pandemic. It has impacted our lives, our communities, and every sector of the economy. Over the past 3 months, I've worked very closely with Governor Gavin Newsom and the administration to fight this pandemic using public health data that has informed our response and also is informing a balanced and safe reopening. Our agency specifically played a very key part in the COVID-19 response in the following ways. In May of this year, thanks to the state legislature, we awarded about $100 million to cities, counties, and continuums of care to provide shelter and services to individuals experiencing homelessness. But our efforts were not just in this space. We were also very focused on keeping families in their homes during the pandemic. I think many of you know that the governor issued an executive order to prevent landlords from evicting tenants. And through our Department of Business Oversight, we worked closely with 200 banks and lenders in the state, and also involved several national lending institutions to offer mortgage forbearance to homeowners. Finally, to help with many Californians who were needing to continue to stay licensed, we initiated a number of waivers to provide greater flexibility that enabled delay in renewal fees and some additional delays. This response to COVID-19 would not have been possible, of course, without the strong partnership and the constant coordination that we have had with local governments. And so I'd like to just pause for a minute to say thank you. Thank you to all of you that have joined us today. Thank you to the City of Los Angeles, to the County of Los Angeles, to the local leaders for your swift and compassionate response to COVID-19. LA has been a leader on many fronts. It was one of the first cities to implement a stay-home order to slow the spread of this disease. And it's also leading the way, protecting and sheltering homeless individuals through California's Project Room Key. In fact, as of the latest numbers, you all have secured about 4,300 hotel rooms, which are at about 80% occupancy. And so ensuring that homeless individuals are protected, secure, and safe. The city has also been an innovative leader, leveraging the federal resources through the CARES Act that has come in both at the state and at the local level. I understand that just recently you all announced a rental assistance program that will have the impact of providing renters assistance or rental assistance to about 50,000 families affected by COVID-19. And so I'm proud of LA, I'm proud of our partnership, and I'm committed to continuing to work for the health and well-being of all Angelenos. And then finally, as we continue our efforts in terms of rebuilding, I do want to make a few comments about how important it is that we embrace equity and being inclusive as we remake and reimagine our economy. We all know that, as you mentioned, Mike, that prior to COVID-19, we already had a housing crisis in place. And the devastating events of the past few weeks and the global pandemic has also revealed deeply rooted problems and underlying inequities that must be addressed. A recent study by the Pew Research Center found that 52% of all lower income families have lost a job or have taken a pay cut because of COVID-19. And that 53% of lower income families cannot pay their bills in full. And people of color and women have also been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. The center also found that 61% of Hispanic Americans and 44% of Black Americans reported losing a job or wage loss compared to 29% of white Americans. As a member of the governor's task force on the business and jobs recovery, we are committed to a more equitable, just, and inclusive recovery. We know that we must think critically about how we invest and how we partner with local communities to address the systemic racial inequities and to have a stronger and more resilient economy. And Governor Newsom just yesterday signed the state's budget and recognized that preserving investments in housing and homelessness, despite the massive deficit, is critically important. A stable, affordable housing market is vital to ending inequity. So I look forward to today's conversation. I look forward to the questions, to listening to your ideas and insights as we continue to support your efforts to rebuild, recover, and reimagine a more equitable and inclusive Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Again, delighted you're with us. You'll be here for questions in just a moment, but I get to introduce our other special guest today. Jeanne Hale is a longtime friend of mine, and Jeanne, very glad that you're able to join us. He's the chair of the Greater Los Angeles African American Chamber of Commerce. He serves on the Los Angeles County Small Business Commission. He's the CEO of G&C Equipment Corporation, which is a construction equipment, materials, and supplies company. President Obama named him to the President's Export Council. He's the past chair of the Congressional Task Force on Small Business Development and past chair of the Caltrans Small Business Advisory Board. Jeanne, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Looking forward to your insights. Jeanne Hale.
Thank you, Mike, and thank all of you, Secretary. Thanks for your remarks. I'm very pleased to be part of this dialogue this morning. As we know, the COVID-19 has had a severe impact on minority businesses, especially African-American businesses. It's estimated that about 40% of those businesses will not reopen 40% of those businesses were at a loss when the payroll protection program came about because they could not get the funding that they needed. Large banks were prioritizing relationships with existing clients, and therefore the African American businesses, and I'm sure other small businesses, had to go to other places to find resources for continuing their operations. I believe that one of the things that has to happen is that we have to reform contracting in the state of California. And I believe that, I think that can happen. The biggest problem that I think that we have as African Americans is the fact that we don't have access to capital. There's a lack of liquidity. We didn't have the capital reserves that large companies had to tide them over during this pandemic. So therefore, we're way behind the curve. And so I think that there has to be some way of finding ways to say, how do we integrate these small businesses back into the community? And I think that contract reform will help us get on the way. But right now, it's just a matter of how do we go about doing that as opposed to just talking about it. So, but it's been a real impact on small businesses. And as far as the unrest, as we'll call it, we didn't witness a lot of small businesses being looted and burned down in this episode. I think that's a testament to the fact that we realize that we need our communities, we need the small businesses within those communities. So, but overall, I think that we have to look at the overall structure of how we do business with people of color. We have to find a way to find large corporations that are willing to hold the hands of some of these small businesses and mentor them in a way where they can be part of that overarching economic structure that we're talking about. So I think that, this will be a different movement this time, but I'm hoping that we can find a way to get more capital into the hands of the small businesses, African-American businesses.
Jeanne, thank you very, very much. I'm going to now dive into the next segment of our program today, and I'm going to moderate a question and answer session based on some questions that I have for our guests, and then we'll dive into questions that you have for our guests. This segment will take about 20 minutes, and we'll reserve another 20 minutes or so for your questions. So I want to, again, turning to our secretary, Castro Ramirez, and to Jeanne, our small business leader here. I want to pick up on comments that both of you made. I think all of us who are participating this morning are very concerned about this. Small business is responsible for the lion's share of our private sector employment here in Los Angeles. And small businesses create an eclectic environment here. People want to be in a city like Los Angeles, want to live here, in part because of the vitality created by this broad array of small businesses, their uniqueness, they're locally owned, and so on. It's different from living in a suburban environment where, for example, there are lots of chain stores and chain restaurants and so forth. The character, the texture, the feel of the city is very different. And until the pandemic, we'd been booming. As we emerge from the pandemic, here and in other cities around the country, there is, as Jeanne said, great concern that we're going to lose huge percentages of our small businesses. Jeanne said there's the fear that we might lose 40% of our African-American-owned small businesses. In New York, they're talking about losing maybe 75% of the mom and pop restaurants in the city. So we need, and I can't underscore the word need enough, we need to have a strategy that lifts up the small businesses of our city and do so in a way that the Secretary indicated that assures a more equitable, inclusive return. That's the framing I'd like to take us into now. So, Madam Secretary, looking at small businesses through that lens, could you share what do you think is the most important question that you've heard from the business community, small businesses in particular, about the role that the state can play? And what's your answer to that question?
Yes, thank you, Mike. I think that what both you and Jeanne have shared about the importance of focusing on small businesses, but also acknowledging that many of our small businesses are run by Latinos, African Americans, women, that it's very important that our strategy as we address the reopening and also the support that businesses will need needs to be sensitive and needs to be inclusive of the demographics of our small businesses. So a few things that I would share with you that are efforts that are underway to provide this level of support. The first is through our agency, through the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. We recently launched a website with resources and toolkits for small businesses. It is called Outsmart Disaster, and it was developed with the mindset of disasters impacting small businesses' ability to be able to continue. And so I'd like to just share with the viewers the website is outsmartdisaster.com. There are a number of toolkits and resources that have been developed and informed by small businesses themselves. Secondly, at the state level, we do have within the governor's office, the Office of Go Biz or Go Business, which is laser focused on developing and identifying additional financial resources. And in July, we are looking to launch a campaign about the importance of supporting local businesses and shopping local. So more information will be available shortly. And then finally, I will say that, being a member of the governor's task force on jobs and recovery, this has been a conversation and a focus as we develop more concrete plans to ensure that local businesses that have been impacted have the ability to access federal resources, state resources, and also local support as they look to reopen their local business establishments.
Madam Secretary, if I might follow up for a moment. So Jeanne Hale mentioned at least two major challenges that especially minority-owned businesses have been confronting. One is, as we know, they were often second or third in line in trying to compete for the federal PPP money and didn't get it because they didn't have the same banking relationships that others had. And the second, in general terms, is access to capital. And both issues lead to the same location, basically, and that is assuring that financial institutions have access, make capital available, especially to struggling small businesses. Right now, the pandemic has cratered the economy, so there are fewer state resources available. If Jeanne were to ask you, I will channel Jeanne for a second and ask you, is the state able to take steps either to enhance access to capital, especially for minority-owned small businesses? And second, is if not access to capital, what concrete steps, if I'm a small business owner, can I look to the state to help me with?
Yes, I definitely think that the state has the role and the responsibility in this area. I agree that contracting and greater focus on expanding opportunities for small minority businesses is an important priority of our state, and so through our Department of General Services and through our procurement practices, we are trying to do our best, to provide greater awareness, technical assistance, and also encouraging, small minority businesses, to apply for opportunities to work, contracting opportunities to work with the state. The second piece is there is no, denying that when the PPE dollars were made available, that small businesses were not able to access the federal resources maybe at the same level as larger businesses. And recognizing that, what we have been doing at the state level is also expanding our partnerships and with smaller with local governments to get information out, to provide that level of technical assistance. And I guess lastly, I will mention that through this COVID-19 response, it's become very clear to us, and I'll just use sort of the case in terms of our approach to addressing homelessness and the initiative around Project Room Key. That partnership was a true sort of demonstration of the importance of having the state work very closely with local government to secure hotels and motels, to provide the technical assistance to make that happen. And that technical assistance and collaboration and communication was ongoing daily across cities. And I do think that as we think about businesses, that is a similar model that we should employ, having our state SCOBIZ office, having various departments that are involved in contracting, continue to be accessible and provide that level of access.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Hey, Jeanne, let me ask you a couple questions here. You always are very direct, and I want to invite that level of candor now. You were around in LA when Rebuild LA was trying to take root after the civil unrest of the 1990s. Are there any lessons that we can take from the Rebuild LA effort that you think we should apply today?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we learned from Rebuild LA was the fact that there was a destruction in the community that didn't benefit anyone. And we found that it was not the way to go about trying to make change, in a sense that we had to be destructive about it. I think that in this case, there's more peaceful protest. There's more coherent dialogue about what needs to be done. The narrative has changed, which is great. But, I sit on the governor's African American Economic Coalition, and we meet with the governor 3 times a year. And we talk about what are these issues and how can we put forth an effort to get more minorities involved with state procurement. One of the things that we talk about is the lack of participation prior to the COVID and the unrest was the fact that the state is not doing enough to stimulate economic change in these communities. And I'll tell you why we say that. I mentioned earlier that if you look at the numbers, minority participation in state procurement is dismal at best. So we've advised the governor that what we need to do is come up with a task force to talk about how we can incorporate other ways of getting things done, as opposed to having Proposition 209 as a wall that we cannot penetrate. There are other small business programs that I think that the state utilized. We're working on those as well. But one of the things that we have done so far, we've met with the Secretary of Transportation. We've met with the Secretary Richardson the other day to talk about it all comes back to lack of participation and lack of access to these contracts, not only at the state level, but at the city level as well. And you can look at the city of LA and find that their procurement, and the city of LA is one of the most diverse cities in the country, as you know. But if you look at their procurement and participation with the minority community, the spending is less than 1%. So how do you think that you can, how can you build an infrastructure if you're not helping the people that lives in that community to go forward? You just can't. So what we're proposing is things like setting up some goals and not quotas. We know that there's a difference between quotas and goals because the Supreme Court struck down quotas. So in some of these departments, like the Department of Water and Power, the City of LA Airport, they have mandatory goals, which does not violate any of the laws. But I tell you what, if you had those kinds of things going on in each department, you would see a tremendous increase in participation and spending with minority businesses.
Well,
And
Jeanne,
that
let me,
way, more participation in spending with minorities, they would hire their own folks, they would build their own communities, but we just got to get to a point where we have to have contracting reform in a way that everybody benefits from that. So I think that's the biggest thing that we focus on the economic side of things, is that all things start with the economics, you know? And so if we can find a way to set up a bonding program, for an example, not run by the city or the state, but funded by the state for assisting small businesses.
so Jeanne, let me ask you a follow-up question. You know, when I was on the city council and to this day as city attorney, I hear from small businesses all the time that city bureaucracy is very hard. I'll use a word that you employed before on contracting, hard to penetrate. And small businesses often feel they need to hire a lobbyist to make their way through the city. I used to say as a council member, you shouldn't have to do that. My staff will help you provide that. Do you think that the city of LA, including but beyond procurement, Jeanne, do we need like a small business department or some similar focused effort to lift up small
Yes,
businesses if we're going to assure the continued vitality of our city?
I agree. Many municipalities have what they call small business commissions. And it's, you know, I've been a proponent of this concept for many years. I used to chair the small business committee for Mayor Hahn. And Eric Garcetti I was the chair, Eric Garcetti was the co-chair, and Wendy Gruel was the co-chair. And that's what we talked about. We talked about what, what can small business to problems about and procurement practice. We have that. And I do believe no.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeanne, you know what? I'm going to cut you off because your connection isn't so great. Maybe you might want to log back in. Maybe that will work. I'm going to turn, because you're saying some very important things. I want everybody to hear them. Let me turn, while you work on the internet connection, Jeanne, to Secretary Castro Ramirez for a couple questions here. The state has been reopening in fits and starts because the pandemic hasn't let go of us. Governor Newsom just forbade bars to reopen. And now, given the numbers we've seen in a couple of recent days, it's possible that the whole state may reverse course and instead of opening, start to close down. Is that what you see? What can you predict for our small businesses about the future of opening in California, given the trends we're seeing in COVID-19 infection rates, but also given the tools we have to suppress those rates?
Yes, Mike, you know, the pandemic is still here. It has not gone away. We have been very methodical and very thoughtful in the reopening, the process, a safe, a reopening. And that has largely been informed by public health data that is gathered at the state level, but also at the local level, and working closely through our Office of Emergency Services and the state and local public health officials. The reopening has been, as many of you know, has been structured into 4 different phases with guidance for various industries. And we're currently in phase 2 of the reopening. And just, for if folks are interested in learning more about the guidelines for reopening in the industries and businesses that can reopen within these phases, I would encourage you all to visit our COVID website. It's covid19.ca.gov. It provides daily updates on numbers by county and by city. It also provides guidelines and guidance to local businesses and industry, both in terms of what can be opened, and also the adjustments that businesses need to make to ensure that their workforce is safe and protected. To your question, Mike, in terms of what can I predict, this pandemic is staying with us, and I think it's very important that we continue to heed the call and the word from our public health officials. I think it's very important that we use face coverings, that we practice social distancing, that we wash our hands regularly, that we provide adequate signage within our establishments in various languages. And also that we find new ways to communicate and to message to communities of color, to communities whose first language is not English. I think we need to find ways to also be more culturally relevant in terms of our messaging, because we know that many of the cases that are now being identified, both in terms of positive, COVID cases and also the increase in hospitalization is due to social transmission. It's due to community transmission. So it is really important that all of us do our part to raise that level of awareness. And then I just wanted to, go back and acknowledge Jeanne's points. I very much appreciate, Jeanne, the recommendations that you were outlining in terms of the role that can play in terms of supporting small businesses. I was just wanted to let you know that I, will follow up both with Secretary Richardson and Secretary Kim. As I mentioned, I've only been just over 3 months in the job, and so I know that we can do a better job in a number of areas, but I definitely take to heart the recommendations and suggestions that you've made regarding contracting and our ability to provide additional support to small businesses.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I want to ask you one question before we proceed to questions from our other participants, and it's this. It may set the stage for other questions from others. Here in Los Angeles, we have several urban centers, downtown, Century City, Woodland Hills, among them, with major office buildings in them. We know that across the country, there are large commercial tenants rethinking whether they will return to office buildings from Manhattan to California because they've learned through the pandemic that their employees can successfully telecommute. So they're rethinking whether they want to be paying large amounts of rent, for example. There are whole ecosystems, economic ecosystems, tied to those big buildings. When people gravitate to them during the day, those workers need to have lunch. So restaurants cluster around those locations. Those workers have other needs for services, a tailor, a dry cleaner, that sort of thing. If the businesses previously occupying those major buildings choose to telecommute with greater frequency, those economic ecosystems can't survive. Have you given thought to how major urban centers should be thinking or rethinking how their downtowns and similar centers function? Some have said, for example, that affordable housing should take the place of some of those commercial tenancies, but will that enable those areas to sustain economic vitality? What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think to the point of, the conversation today that it's, rebuilding, recovering, but also reimagining. I think that this pandemic has, changed the way we see things, the way that we look at, traditional assets in our community. And I think to the extent that at the local level, it makes sense to reposition some of the assets for a different use. I do think that that's a conversation that we should be having. And as an example, that's exactly what we've done through Project Room Key. We worked with local government to secure access to rooms within motels and hotels that were underutilized, and having the need to have safe, isolated spaces for individuals experiencing homelessness that either tested positive or were asymptomatic or at higher risk. We were able to secure agreements that led, to accessing these rooms within these motels and hotels. And we're now working to make and convert some of these hotels into permanent housing. Just yesterday, with the governor's signing the state budget, a total of $600 million has been allocated to make available to local communities to purchase hotels and to convert them into housing. And so we are also aligning our systems within our Department of Housing and Community Development, identify additional housing resources to support communities that decide to convert these temporary, the hotel, motel rooms into permanent housing. So we're going from calling it Project Room Key to calling it Project Home Key, creating, homes in a stable housing environment for individuals that were lacking housing, prior to being moved in.
All right, do we have, Rob, we have questions from our participants?
Can you give out the information again so people...
Okay, so if people want to ask questions, please send an email to rob.wilcox, rob.wilcox@lacity.org. I also want to point out that we have with us my special assistant for another few hours, Capri Maddox, who is about to become the head of the city's new department on civil rights and human rights enforcement. So, and Capri has a question to kick us off. Capri?
All right, thank you so much, Mike. I am so delighted to be here, and I'm so honored to have the privilege of serving with you for so many years, almost 7 years of service with you in this administration. And you've just done a great job in moving forward the needle on equity, particularly as it relates to the business community. I definitely wanted to thank our two panelists doing amazing work, and I'm hoping to work with both of you in my new role. Obviously, we all know the stats. We don't need any more research. We know that there are inequities from years gone by that banks, government, et cetera, have been involved in as it relates to redlining loans, and even in this crisis with the paycheck protection and the inability of people of color to get these loans. So my question is, when we think about the repeal of Prop 209, being on the horizon, I just want to know how the city and the state could be really ready in advance of the repeal of 209 so that we can hit the ground running and provide services and resources to communities in need that have been ignored for far too long. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Capri. So actually, I'm going to start to answer that question and say this. First, in the city, there are some legal impediments to doing the kind of procurement reform that you and Jeanne have alluded to, including the city's charter, which will need to change along with Prop 209 to create the conditions that people are asking for. So there is now an effort, and there's some other steps that we have to take as well in the city. That effort is underway. I anticipate the possibility of a charter change coming down the pike. And I think that there will be an increased emphasis on taking the affirmative steps necessary to create access to opportunities. That, I think, is what you and what Jeanne have been talking about. Let's create access to opportunities so that minority and women-owned businesses are able to compete. Jeanne is right. The percentages are pathetic in the city when it comes to that kind of participation. He's also right that there are efforts that the city has been making to establish some goals, but they need to be more robust. So that's my way to start off that conversation. I think there's broad agreement about the goal. There are means still to be undertaken to get to the goal. I don't know if either the Secretary or Jeanne would like to answer that question further. Otherwise, I'll proceed to the next question. All right. Thank you, Capri. So we have Kevin Garvan wants to ask a question. Kevin?
Good morning. Thank you for having this panel. Thank you for everyone who's participating. That's Kelvin Garvan.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that.
I'm bold enough to ask this question because Jeanne Hale was talking about repeals, and I'm concerned about amendment, the AB 2178. This Emergency Assistance Act, I think, overlooks the fact that there's a possibility for food to be considered an essential service during an emergency, so that things like farmers markets being closed, that wouldn't happen during an emergency, like we've experienced here in Los Angeles. And at the same time, the creation within that of an actual emergency response program for food establishments. So if there's funding coming from a federal level and from the state level, if you have food establishments in local communities who say, yes, we will supply what is needed during an emergency. When that emergency happens, funds will go directly to them. Because what I've noticed is there are a number of different food establishments, especially African American and people of color, that are not in these programs like Room Key and would benefit from having said, when they go into business, yes, we are willing to serve the community, and this is the budget that would be required to serve the people in the community. And we will do it as soon as the lights go out, as soon as there's a fire, as soon as there's a flood, or if there's even an economic downturn. And what I'm saying this is almost if you get on a plane and a flight attendant says, excuse me, would you like to sit next to the exit, the emergency exit? And you say, well, what does that mean? And they tell you what you would have to do. And if you voluntarily say yes, then you can sit there. But if you say, no, I don't want to do that, then they'll ask someone else. And I think that moving forward, there's going to be a necessity to help local food establishments to stay open and also continue feeding people in the communities which they would serve even without any type of disaster.
Thank you, Kelvin.
So,
very provocative
amend
question.
2178, create a deliberate plan for food emergency response so that if I opened a taqueria, I said, yes, I'm going to do this on Central Avenue if something were to occur. And when monies come in, that money will provide the funding for me to do what I promised to do because I'm anchored in the community and I'm an entrepreneur and I want to survive.
Got it. Kelvin, thank you very much. Madam Secretary, do you have any response to Kelvin? You're referring to a piece of state legislation, right, Kelvin? Yes. Madam Secretary, have you had any input into that state bill, and do you have any thoughts about Kelvin's question?
Let me see. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Go, sure.
I have not been involved, Kelvin, on this particular legislation that you've referenced, but I have noted, the concerns that you've expressed and the reason for pursuing an amendment. And I, can follow up. Our Secretary of Food and Agriculture, Karen Ross, is actively engaged on a number of fronts, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic, working closely with the agricultural community, working closely also with small grocers. And so let me follow up. I just haven't been involved personally myself. But thank you for your comment.
Very good. But we created a connections for Kelvin and the Secretary to follow up with each other. Very good. Charles Weiss has a question. Charles?
Thank you, Mr. City Attorney, and to all the panelists. It was really, this has been very thought-provoking. I want to expand on Kelvin's last point because that is a brilliant way to make us more resilient. And I had a broader question about resiliency. Obviously, COVID-19 and past crises, frankly, have exposed for all of us that our society has a lack of resiliency, and we rely on very distant supply chains for our basic necessities, whether it's medicine or in some cases food products, water, hospital and household supplies, and energy. And that really we need to become more self-sufficient in producing with local Angelinos, doing the work, using local resources wherever possible, and manufacturing our goods and raw materials and building materials and energy supplies here. Do you see an opportunity out of COVID-19 for the state and the city to collaborate in a concerted expansion of our local manufacturing and production so we can help local businesses and restore the lost jobs that have affected so many, and also at the same time really make us better prepared and more resilient for the next crisis we'll undoubtedly face? Thank you.
Thank you. So Charles says the COVID pandemic has exposed real deficiencies in our supply chains, and a lack of manufacturing here in Los Angeles contributes to those deficiencies. Charles says, is there a way that LA and the state could collaborate to help revitalize LA's declining manufacturing base so the supply chains can be more localized and we're more resilient in the future?
But I think there's a couple of things that could happen. The state could institute some programs that would encourage more participation from people of color, and also have programs that would encourage the hiring of the people in the community to do that. But I think that when I was on President Obama's Export Council, one of the things that we thought would be the best thing to do was to encourage people to do more manufacturing, and that way you could hire more people. But I don't know really at this point what plan of attack there is to encourage people to do this. I'm just not, I guess I'm just not up to date on that just yet.
Okay. All right. Madam Secretary, do you have any thoughts in response to Charles' question?
Well, I mean, I think that I think it's a very important point to be made, right? Again, to the point that I made earlier, that this pandemic has changed just the way that we view everything at the local level, within our communities, the economy, at the state level, and so we need these. We need to continue, to elevate not only these discussions, but also recommendations on how to be able to support local manufacturing. And through, the governor's, task force on jobs and recovery, these are the types of conversations and also proposals that are being generated. And again, I guess, I would say that, part of the benefit of also me, participating in this conversation, Mike, with you and Jeanne and everyone else, is the ability to walk away with, concrete recommendations and suggestions from all of you, and, socialize them and elevate them to others within the administration. And so I'd really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that.
And let me just contribute 1 second before our next question and say, Charles' question, Jeanne's input, Kelvin's suggestions as well, all kind of militate in the same direction. See, for one thing, we're going to need to be more locally in charge of our destinies. If we're going to do that, Secretary Castro Ramirez began by saying, if we imagine the next iteration of Los Angeles, LA 2.0, we're going to have to be more inclusive and equitable in who those businesses are and how they flourish. And an implication of Charles's question goes beyond setting up a manufacturing company someplace. It goes to who works there. Jeanne says, let's make sure that there are some goals to assure inclusivity in that workforce. Beyond that, we have a whole slew of employees who don't have jobs to go back to. And another implication for a broader conversation is, how are we going to, as a city and a state, work with our federal partners as well to retrain people who can't go back to jobs that don't exist? As we go into the next version of our city, we really haven't had the leadership necessary to assure that as we go to the next version of our economy, that the workers who are populating that economy, that the business owners who are building and fueling that economy reflect the diversity of our city. What, in your role, do you anticipate doing to change that?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. It is very clear that we do have so many disparities for so long, and we need to move forward as it relates to, of course, the focus is hate crimes, discriminatory behavior, and patterns, but we have another section that is going to be the Office of Racial Equity, which will allow us to work on upward mobility events. So we're not going to be just satisfied that we don't have hate crimes anymore, or we don't have discriminatory behaviors in commerce, employment, education, and housing, which is where we have enforcement authority. We are interested in upward mobility events. So we will be partnering with the business community, particularly our banks and our lending institutions and other partners, and even corporations that could serve as mentors, to do what we call boot camp events. We'll have them for college, if people want to go to college, to allow their families to go into the middle class and upper middle class and beyond. But we will do the same thing for home ownership. As we know, home ownership has been an issue of where discriminatory behaviors has had a devastating effect on the economic wealth for so many families for so long. And the final thing is for our business community to actually show people how to go into businesses and
in that effort to make sure that people are able to get these jobs as well, that are, particularly if we bring in more manufacturing, more positions of this like. I think it's very important to know that we've been working with a number of institutions like our CBOs, community-based organizations, faith-based institutions, of course, business groups like, these forums, as well as our neighborhood councils and local universities. So I think the question is great, it's timely, and I want you to know that we will be having upward mobility events. We just received a grant that's in the works from Google to help us have upward mobility events and planning. They may be virtual, or we may wait out the pandemic and see if we can, have them in person. So that's definitely something that's on the forefront and on the horizon. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Capri.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks. I have a question for our panelists, and for that matter, others who want to email Rob, because they have answers too. I'd like to, as we wind down this session today, know what lessons people are learning from small businesses that are, they're conducting themselves differently in the pandemic, and as a result are taking positive lessons from that about how they can thrive in a different way once the pandemic is done. Have we been hearing from businesses saying, you know what, I learned that I could do much more effective work online, for example, and so I'm going to be pouring resources into the online facet of my business long after the pandemic is history? Are we hearing from them about the nature of the employees they're hiring, the training they're engaged in, the way they are targeting their services and goods to the communities they serve? Any positive lessons we're hearing that will last beyond the pandemic? Jeanne or Secretary Castro Ramirez first?
So glad that you're ending on this note, because I think that there's an opportunity and much more that we can do to have a space, for a collection of, these lessons, these experiences, things that are working out. I, mentioned earlier that our state's Go Biz operation is working on a campaign to shop local and to shop local in a safe manner. And this, campaign has been informed by local businesses. And so I think that doing everything possible when we create programs or when we are, looking to disseminate additional resources, it has to be, our efforts have to be informed by people that are on the ground, by people that are operating these small businesses. It's not enough for, policymakers or administrators, to create these programs. And I think the lesson for us has been that has been our commitment, to do things in partnership with local government, to do so in partnership with local businesses, with people that are on the ground doing this work every day. And I'll just, encourage you all to visit the covid19.ca.gov website, also the outsmartdisaster.com website. And then lastly, Capri, congratulations to you on your new role. I look forward to being partners with you. And it's a pleasure meeting you, Jeanne, and look forward to following up.
Thank you. It occurs to me, Jeanne, before we turn to you, I was going to say, one possibility would be for the state or the city or both to set up virtual bulletin boards where small businesses can contribute their positive ideas. Here's what we learned that they want to share with others. Jeanne mentioned the importance of mentorship in the context of procurement. But that idea of mentorship could be as muscular as someone taking someone else under their wing. It could also include lots of sharing of information with each other. And you might want to consider having those kind of virtual message boards up throughout the state. Jeanne, any last words you'd like to share?
I just think that one thing that the small businesses have learned during this epidemic is the fact that many of them won't have the same business model when this is all over. And so they're learning how to pivot. I think that that's important because, the economy will change. The demand for certain services will not be the same, like restaurants, barbershops, beauty salons, and the whole shot. So I think that for the long term, for the future, companies will always think about what would I have to do to continue to be an ongoing concern if I had faced another pandemic like this.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you all very, very much. We have to conclude for this morning. Let me say how much I appreciate the participation of Jeanne Hale and Secretary Castro Ramirez and all of you who chose to join us today for this important discussion. We're going to convene a series of conversations focused on rebuilding and recovering and reimagining Los Angeles. We started with this one because I'm so concerned, as I mentioned at the outset, that we need to retain this small business vitality that makes Los Angeles so vibrant. And we need to do it in a way that we come back beyond normal to a whole new level where the principles of equity and inclusivity and sustainability and livability are at the core of the next version of Los Angeles. We're just getting started. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your leadership. Good morning. Take care.